Good morning. Today is the 10th of Adar, and it's also the 3rd of March. And in the Torah reading, we're reading actually the 6th reading today of Parashat Tetzaveh, but we started the topic yesterday, just touched upon it, and I want to finish it today. We'll see if we get to something more from today's Torah reading. So the topic that we started with was that to initiate the priests. In the 5th reading, we read that in order to initiate the priests, Aaron and his sons, into their duties, they spend 7 days of initiation. And during these 7 days, they brought different types of sacrifices. Now there's a sacrifice that we're going to meet a lot of in the book of Leviticus, but it shows up here the first time, basically. And it's called a peace offering. So in our present context, it's not exactly the usual peace offering. There's a few things that are different about it, but the main characteristic is there. And the main characteristic is that a peace offering is eaten both by the person bringing the sacrifice and by the altar. In other words, it's shared. It's shared by man and God, as it were. They both eat from it. The altar is considered to be like as if burning something on the altar means that it's eaten up, as it were, by the divine presence. Now, on the face of it, this is even a very difficult concept, because how could it be, or why would it be, that the person bringing the sacrifice should also be allowed to eat from it? The whole idea of a sacrifice is that you're sacrificing something, you're sacrificing it, and you're getting something back. So what kind of sacrifice is that? That question leads to a very important halacha that is not so well known, which is that when the temple in Jerusalem stood, every human being in the world was permitted to bring a sacrifice. There was only one small difference, that non-Jews could only bring a burnt sacrifice. In other words, they could only bring a sacrifice that was entirely consumed on the altar. While Jews, most of the sacrifices that Jews brought were of this type. They're called peace offerings, shlamim, as we said. They're considered more whole, and they would eat from it within, and you had to eat from it within Jerusalem for 2 days, for the next 2 days after the sacrifice was offered. And like I said, that was the original meaning of a sudat mitzvah, of a feast that was a mitzvah also. And a special bracha was said over the meat, and so on. Why this difference? The usual explanation is that it's difficult for someone who is not serving God from the point of view of Judaism to accept that it could be possible for us to be partners with God. The way that non-Jews usually view the relationship is that it is entirely a subservient relationship. It's not one that's based on partnership. We actually saw the idea of partnership earlier in Parashat Yitro, when Jethro suggested his idea about how to set up courts and so on. Before that, Moses was judging the people from morning till evening, and the sages say that from that verse we learn that anybody who dedicates his life to justice, in the sense of becoming a judge, and is serving the public, serving the people, by doing that, it's as if he's become a partner with God in creation. Why? Because justice is needed in order to rectify society. You can't have a rectified society and a functioning society without a justice system. So that's up to man to provide. And a person who dedicates his life to that is considered to have fulfilled or completed the creation. The creation would not be able to sustain itself if human beings were not able to create a just society, a society that could be sustainable. But here we're talking about becoming a partner with God in terms of what we do and what we eat and what we sacrifice. The Zohar that I began to mention yesterday learned something incredible from Job. And I very much love the book of Job, and I think anybody who studies the inner teachings of Torah is very connected to Job, because Job is a book that is predominantly a psychological book. It's predominantly dealing with the difficulties that a human being has in facing life. And because of that, it lends itself very strongly, especially in a work like the Zohar, which is very motivated to understand the inner workings of our psyche. It lends itself to incredible analysis. And the Zohar on our Parsha, actually very much towards the beginning, goes into the book of Job in a way that most people have never heard. And what does it say? It says that Job was not being tested. He says it can't be that he was being tested. Why? Because we're missing the verb nisa. Nisa means to test. When Abraham was tested, it says, V'elokim nisa et Avram. That God tested Abraham. When the Jewish people were tested in the wilderness, it says, V'tenasuni, or you've tested me, I've tested you. Again, the same verb appears. And tests need to be defined as such by the Torah. But no such thing is happening by Job. What is happening by Job, says the Zohar? Why did God instigate, or one might say he prodded the Satan to come and, it sounds like testing, but he prodded him to look at Job and see, and he asks him, is there anybody as righteous, as pious as Job is in the entire earth? And the Satan comes and says, everything that he does, he does because you give him so much. Take away something from him and you'll see that he's not as pious as you think he is. The Zohar then proceeds to say, God prodded Satan because Job was doing something that a person should not do. He was being too pious. Now we think that maybe, that's not true. You should always strive to be the most pious that you can. But the Zohar is very careful in telling you, you have to know your limits. And the limits of most human beings is that when they do something for God, they need to feel in some way that they are being rewarded. They need to feel in some way that they are getting something back from this. Now, the way that this is described in the time of the Zohar is not exactly that the person needs to feel. It's described as the evil inclination, or what we call the other side, needs to get its due reward. And so it says, Job brought sacrifices, and all his sacrifices were of the burnt offering type. But because it were all of the burnt offering type, the other side was not receiving anything. Now when you translate this into saying that he himself, Job, was not eating from these sacrifices because they were completely consumed, and he would bring sacrifices every single week, because every single week his children would go through a whole cycle of feasting and merriment and all these things, and he was afraid that they might have sinned. So every single week he brought many sacrifices, and all these sacrifices were burnt offerings. The Zohar says this is a state of being overly pious. Why? Because a human being cannot sustain that level of sacrifice. Not forever anyway. And what begins to happen is that he begins to resent, on the inside, he begins to resent what he's being forced to do. And so the Zohar reads that not only was he pious, but it also says in the verse that describes him in Job, Vesar Mera, which means, and refraining from evil. Says the Zohar, what this means is that he would never give call it the other side, but the inner self, which needs, call it the evil inclination within us, the animal soul within us, he would never let it take part. He never gave it its due. He never gave it what it needed in order to live. And because of that, in the end, the evil inclination, the other side, came back at him with a vengeance. And that's actually, so in a sense, what it's saying is that all that Job suffered was a result of his own resentment. That resentment leads to suffering. it leads to pain, it leads to disease, it leads to all manners of bad luck and misfortune. And indeed, says the Zohar, it was only when God got involved in the sense that he told him, look, you're not perfect. The questions that God asks him in the end were to teach him, you don't understand the world so well that you can come and claim that you are perfect and you know everything, and that you can act as if you yourself are God, and that you can act in an entirely only self-sacrificing way. It's abnormal. It doesn't exist. And so, or there might be one person in a generation who's like that, but a person can't strive by himself to get to that level. Instead, we need to know that there are limits on what we are capable of achieving in that sense. So for instance, when a person gives tzedakah, he gives charity, his heart naturally contracts at that moment. He says, but this is my hard-earned money. How can I give it to someone else? How can I give it to some other cause? It's mine. And so we say to him, don't ignore that. Don't come and say to yourself, oh, I shouldn't feel that at all. No, it's not normal to not feel that. I want to tell a story about how one should feel. It's very interesting. I was going to talk about this yesterday, and suddenly my daughter came in the evening and asked me a question. She said, should I do something good for someone even though I'm getting something out of it? Even though I have self-interest in it? And I told her, look, as much as you can, don't have self-interest. But if you do, you can't run away from it. You're a human being. And I told her the famous story that the Lubavitcher Rebbe told many times. The Midler Rebbe had many Hasidim who would go around the countryside, and they would teach Hasidus, they would teach Torah to common people. And one of them came to him one time and said, there's many, many people who commend me for the beauty of what I teach, and I feel that it affects my pride tremendously. And I want to know from the Rebbe, should I stop because it affects my pride, or should I continue? Because if it's affecting my pride, what's the point? I'm losing in my battle against my evil inclination. I'm becoming more and more self-centered. The Rebbe said to him, even if you turn into an onion, you should continue to speak Chassidus. The way you are doesn't matter. Now, why an onion? Why did he say you turn into an onion? Well, there's two different explanations. The explanation the Rebbe said was very simple. He said an onion is used as a spice. You can't make an entire dish out of onions. You can only add onions as a condiment, as something that you add to the dish itself. It can't be the main part of the dish. So he says the same thing. Even though you're doing a mitzvah, you need to know that there's going to be onions involved. And the onions are they're charif, they're hot, they're bitter, they're this, they're that. It goes with making food that you have to add this type of ingredient. It goes with doing a mitzvah that you will have self-interest, that you will have your evil inclination asking for its part. And so the Torah says, don't be afraid of that. Don't be afraid of the fact that you're a human being. Accept it. And okay, so if you go and you do a great mitzvah and you give so much tzedakah, a person gives $1 million to some charity, and then he comes and says, but I deserve to have a nicer house, and he goes and spends another $200,000 to renovate his house. So we say to him, Gesundheit, should be well. Why? Because you have to take care of that need inside as well, not to fall into the state where you're afraid of being a partner with God, and you begin to think that maybe you are God. Here you are doing it all by yourself. There's nothing wrong with you. Everything that you do is perfect. So God willing, we should take this to heart, this lesson. Maybe some other time I'll explain what the other meaning of the onion, of being an onion is. Not right now.
Beautiful teaching. Thank
we'll
you
talk
very
about
much.
And good Shabbos, and hope to see you actually in a week and a half. I'll see you on Sunday, God willing. Also, yes.
Yeah.